Hello everyone and welcome back to another exciting episode of Clinically Correlate with Azfar and Vedant. We are super excited to welcome back Michael Johnson from physiciancontracts.com. In our first interview with Michael, we discussed physician contracts with broad strokes to set the groundwork on approaching any physician contract. In this episode, we will delve into the details of a diagnostic radiology contract and explore beyond the basics on what radiology trainees should keep in mind prior to signing their very first attending physician contract. We're also excited to partner with RAD Discord for this podcast episode. RAD Discord is the largest community of professional radiologists and radiology trainees in the world. It was founded in October of 2020 in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic to bring the global community of radiologists together to support each other. Today, RAD Discord boasts over 3,000 radiologists from all subspecialties and over 50 nations. Other than member-driven discussions on all aspects of radiology, RAD Discord is specially known for its educational content and case reviews led by expert radiology faculty and radiology trainees, for which it earned the 2022 OMNI Award in Best Educational Mobile App. To learn more, visit raddiscord.com. It is free to join to all verified radiologists and radiology trainees.
Finally, as of recording this video, we want to say that we're close to 100 subscribers. We're currently at 97, so thank you for everyone who's already come on this journey and supported us. We're about to be close to our 20th episode on this podcast, and from what we've learned is about only 1% of podcasters ever get to 20 episodes. So if you have enjoyed this and you haven't liked or subscribed to our videos yet, please do. We'd really appreciate it.
With that said, let's start the episode.
Michael, welcome back to the podcast. So happy to have you. It was really nice having you in the last one where you kind of talked about physician contracts in general. Today we have you back to specifically talk about diagnostic radiology contracts, kind of nationally and, very specific questions that we have prepared. So it's going to be a little bit of like a rapid fire style this time. We'll kind of get started with these questions. So, with the first one, you mentioned it during the last conversation about like benchmark salary ranges for diagnostic radiology and that being the cornerstone when you're making a contract negotiation. So can you just walk us through all of that?
Yeah. So first off, thank you so much. I had so much fun last time chatting with y'all, and I'm enjoying watching you build a podcast. It's a lot of fun. So I hope you guys keep it going. It's cool. So with compensation data, it's important to understand what information is out there to compare to whatever offers you're getting. All of you are going to have multiple offers if you want them. There's going to be multiple opportunities for you to do work. There's a huge radiology shortage, and I see it in my practice quite obviously. There's a handful of specialties where there's just such an obvious gap between volume and supply. So you'll want to know what information is out there to compare. So I put together some of the data. I'm going to present it for the folks watching in YouTube. We'll show it here, but for others, I'll talk through it. But MGMA is a group that surveys a bunch of physicians regarding their compensation. They collect data on compensation, on work volume, on location, on practice setting, on the number of years that you've been in your specialty, whether you work in a big practice or a small practice or a private practice, or whether you're paid on a 1099 or a W-2. They collect a lot of information, and then they gather it together and then sell it for a bunch of money to folks like me that then talk about it, right? So there's information out there that you can compare. I pulled 3 examples here for diagnostic radiology. I wanted to show how there's basically 3 main practice settings. Okay. You need to know what academics is paying, what hospital-based employment is paying, and then also what physician-owned private practices are paying. So in this example, we see in diagnostic radiology, I'm talking about the 25th and 75th percentiles for these data sets. So for an academic position at the rank of assistant professor, and looking at the national data for assistant professors in academic positions in diagnostic radiology, the 25th and 75th percentile range for total compensation is between $362,000 and $465,000 per year. The amount that you're paid per work RVU is between about 41 and 65, and that's off of a volume of 7,000 to about 11,000 work RVUs. So what you'll see is that the total comp is a bit lower compared to the other practice settings, but the work RVUs, the amount that you're paid for each RVU, and the amount of volume you're expected to provide is kind of commensurate with that total comp. Okay, it's a little bit less volume and kind of a middling to low middling compensation per unit. When you compare that to the most lucrative, like subdivided section that I was able to find for diagnostic radiology, and that's physician-owned private practices in the South, we see total comp numbers just completely different than academics. Okay. For physician-owned private practice in the South, the 25th and 75th percentiles for total compensation are between 666,000 and about 800,000. So we're talking like close to double what an academic assistant professor is going to make in the same practice setting. Quite substantial. But what the data also shows us is that physicians in this practice setting are often doing twice as much work. So when you kind of start to compare the total compensation packages and the amount that they're paid per unit of work, there starts to become a reversion to the mean here. So the punchline for compensation and understanding what like data is out there, what information is out there, is you need to know not what your specialty pays, but you need to know what your practice setting and your geographic region pays for various volume expectations. So the idea that a diagnostic radiologist should make X doesn't really make any sense. Okay. What you should ask is, for a diagnostic radiologist in this specific practice setting, whether it's hospital-based employment or physician-owned private practice or in an academic setting, in my setting, okay, and in the geographic region that you want to go to, and with volume expectations of X, whatever that is, the data suggests a compensation range of, whatever it shows. Okay. Your compensation within your specialty is going to be driven by your practice setting and geographic region and volume expectations. And those can vary wildly within the same specialty. Okay. What we want to try to avoid when we're negotiating our first contract is a job that doesn't pay as much, but requires a lot of work. Like, it's kind of basic, it's not that complicated, right? So we also want to know, as your volume might change over your career, over your time with a particular employer, how does your compensation change? Does your compensation go up and down fairly? Or are you maybe stuck at a flat salary? Is it not changing at all? A lot of academic positions are at a flat salary. Some will pay based on volume, but a lot of them are flat salary model. If you're in a private practice setting, you want to watch out for a flat salary only type compensation model, because the practice has an incentive to load you up on volume and get a really good deal out of their flat salary, right? If they pay a flat amount for your work, then they're going to require a lot of work. They're motivated for that. So this is kind of intro into how to compare compensation and work RVUs and different jobs and kind of understanding where it goes. This is just a very basic intro for MGMA compensation data. This data changes annually, and like just relying on this brief discussion about it is not a good idea. Like you really need to know what it means for your practice setting and your geographic region and how it's updated over time. And I encourage you to get that. I think residency programs, fellowship programs should buy this information for their residents and fellows, but often they don't. So maybe inquire about that. I think it makes sense.
Got it. Yeah, that was super helpful. Kind of going like based off the numbers you showed. What was interesting was, I think you alluded to it, like in the South, even if like the total compensation was higher, the actual dollar per RVU was lower, right? And then that was probably in like the 30 to 40 like dollar range, and then the other practice regions that you were talking about were like anywhere from 35 to 70. Is that $30? Is that effectively like the Medicare rate? So that's like the going floor effectively for our services, and then anything on top of that is just depending on like the insurance case mix for that practice. And
yeah, it really just depends. It's hard to say exactly what your employers are paid for your work, especially in radiology. That gets a lot easier in like cash pay dermatology, for example. Like in that, like a cash pay psychiatry practice, super easy to know exactly what the employer on the other side is making off of your work, and you can do a percentage. You can kind of do the math on their side, but it gets really difficult when Medicare is involved, when you're maybe working for hospitals, maybe there's very complex contracts. More insurance contracts are moving towards value-based aspects of the compensation, so it's not purely fee for service sometimes. So they're changing over time, which makes it difficult to say exactly what it is. Yeah.
Got it. And then, have you seen a lot of value-based contracts in radiology, or is that still in like the upcoming pipeline?
I think it's more in the upcoming pipeline for radiology. That hasn't been a focus. A lot of diagnostic radiology contracts, they'll pay you maybe per shift, like a minimum per shift rate. Maybe they'll pay like per slide. Sometimes they have a different measurement. They pay you per slide instead of per work RVU. Sometimes they have like a bonus based on whether you're reading at night or during the day or in the morning. They kind of differentiate it based on shift. There's so many different ways to compensate a diagnostic radiologist. I just see tons of different options here. So understanding kind of how that matches against your work volume isn't always like super clear, so.
Got it. And then, so going to that point of, I know, overnight telerads is definitely like a lot of the job opportunities you can find on like, say, like the ACR job posting website. Do you have like a semblance of like almost what the surge pricing that we're getting based off of, what you're reading?
Yeah, it can be substantial. It can be, 10 or 20% more. It really just depends. Negotiating around those rates might be possible. Sometimes there's like, I've seen contracts in diagnostic radiology where you're required to provide a certain number of shifts, but then if there's a need, then sometimes they'll start like throwing it out to the group like, hey, we're doing a 10% premium or 20% premium on a particular shift because we don't have enough coverage, or we're getting a little out over our skis here. So some will offer premium based on, their particular volume at a time.
Got it. That makes sense. No, I really appreciate those slides because I like you said, the last component, which is you have to take that data and then individualize it to your specific environment. I think even just seeing within our kind of local environment, if there's a flat salary for radiologists across the board, even depending on what subspecialty you're reading, there could be a lot of variation between that, just based off of, both the RVUs generated for those studies and then overall the coverage there. And so I think like ultimately getting it down to the dollar per RVU, and then that way that's like the one metric that you can then look at with all your different comps to see, what works in your favor. And, like you alluded to, it's not necessarily that's the only thing that you should look for, but at least it gives you something that you can compare apples to apples.
Yeah. It's a starting point, right? It is not, I like to say, MGMA is not the holy grail. Okay, it is not the only thing that you should think about for compensation. And you shouldn't only look at the total compensation aspect of MGMA. You got to look at the volume piece. You want to look at when you're required to work, whether that matches your career goals and life plans, that practice setting makes sense for you, if that's where you want to be and how you want to practice. There's a lot that goes into it, but it at least gives you something to, start an analysis around.
100%.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to move right along to another very important aspect of the contract. And you briefly touched upon this on on our first interview, which is, the non-compete and the non-solicit clause. Now, could you re-expand upon the difference between a non-compete and a non-solicit clause? And could you identify some ways that the physician may be able to make the non-solicit clause favorable to them when they're signing their attending contract?
Yeah. So the non-compete clause generally speaks to a geographic restriction on where you can work, which gets kind of interesting in diagnostic radiology because like where you are physically located might not be where the image is originating, right? So often the non-compete will speak to where the image originated in DRADs, but not where the physician that is reading it is physically located. Those can be different. So it's an important issue to make sure you understand in your contract. Like I don't know that I've seen every way that this could be written, but we want to make sure that you have some measure of understanding that says, okay, from the non-compete side, it speaks to a geographic restriction on where images originate that I can read. And if, assuming this is enforceable and it's enforceable in the vast majority of states, you need to plan an exit strategy accordingly. The non-solicit clause generally speaks to the valuable relationships that you develop or potentially develop during your employment. So as if it's with staff, that's an obvious one. You don't really do that with patients necessarily in diagnostic radiology, but there is an important relationship between most employers and the hospitals, like where they're generating their work from. They're going to want to protect basically their middleman status between you and the originator of the image or the work, right? So often the non-solicit will prevent you from reaching out to hospitals, locations that provided work to that employer. Sometimes that's limited to only the work that you did for that employer. Sometimes it is expansive. It is every contract that particular employer has to receive work from any other source. Sometimes it's like, you gotta think about this also in like the rad partners context. Like a lot of folks are working for rad partners groups. Where is the dividing line between the different groups? If you have a non-solicit clause, let's say, that speaks to a restriction on reading for any facility that has a contract with any rad partners, that could become quite problematic. Or is it where you read for the practice that you were working for? Non-solicit clauses, I'm even having a hard time explaining it right now. They're very challenging to clearly define in diagnostic radiologists because of the nature of your work. So you want to pay very close attention. There's a number of ways to potentially improve non-competes and non-solicits to negotiate them to be better. A lot of first contract physicians or physicians at any point in their career, they'll say, can you remove the non-compete and non-solicit? Collectively, they're called the restrictive covenants. Sometimes there's additional restrictive covenants like confidentiality clauses and non-disparagement clauses. But focusing on the non-compete and non-solicit for the moment, sometimes physicians will say, can you remove those? And the business sometimes really can't. Like if your employer, like the whole existence of the business is based on them, like you not being able to contract around them directly with the hospital or directly with the facility that they're receiving work from, their whole business model is based on protecting their middleman status, then like, no, they're not going to do that, right? They kind of have to maintain that barrier. But there's a number of options between yes and no. Okay. You can ask for a carve out for how the contract ends. So if your employment agreement ends via employer termination without cause, then it would follow that you should have fewer restrictions upon exit. If the employer is choosing to not retain you anymore, then it's through no fault of your own. You didn't commit malpractice, you didn't stop showing up, you didn't show up drunk, you didn't commit a felony, like you didn't do all these things, you didn't lose your medical license, but they just decided that they wanted to hire somebody else and they didn't want to retain you anymore. If they let you go without cause, then you really shouldn't have to follow the non-compete or non-solicit. The vast majority of contracts, though, allow the employer to still enforce those regardless of the reason for termination. So that's an option that's available. Sometimes we want to restrict a geographic limitation. So if it's a 10 or 20 mile restriction around a particular facility or group of facilities, then we can ask for a smaller bubble. We can often ask for a limit to like what facilities it would apply to. If you have like, let's say you work primarily for one hospital, okay, and let's say maybe that employer has some other contracts with other facilities, but you don't really work under those contracts. You work primarily under the one hospital contract. Sometimes we can work in a one location, primary location, non-compete or non-solicit. So it restricts the number of restrictive areas that apply to you. That's an option. You can also ask for the contract to be made a little bit better over time. So if you give them 2 years or 3 years or 5 years of service, some employers are willing to negotiate for that, to say, okay, if you leave before 2 years, then the non-compete is 2 years and 30 miles. But if you stay for at least 2 years, now the non-compete maybe is 10 miles, maybe is 1 year instead of 2 years. It's obviously another option. Just ask for a shorter period of time. What you should choose to negotiate really just depends on your personal situation. A little bit different for everybody. This is where like having a thoughtful attorney that does this regularly can really help you. It's like, okay, we have all these options. Which one is best for you? Often taking a scattershot approach and asking for all of those is really not the best choice. Sometimes it's better to really like pinpoint exactly what would be most helpful for you, and kind of talking that out with a lawyer that's done this regularly could be very helpful.
I think an important way that you kind of mentioned that we can have a favorable position in negotiation is with cause versus without cause termination. And you briefly touched upon it. So with cause, it means something bad that I did, the physician did, that is causing them to get terminated, losing their license. And without cause means there's nothing wrong with the physician. The practice just has to let the physician go. Are there, could you kind of expand upon the with cause termination and what the timeline sort of looks like, and what are some causes that you have seen that a practice has used as reasons to let the physician go?
Sure. There's a whole host of ways that they can structure the termination for cause clause. The most common reasons that they can terminate you for cause: commit a felony, you lose your medical license, you commit a bunch of malpractice, they can no longer get malpractice insurance to provide coverage for your work. you stop showing up, you show up drunk, you stop abiding by their like their rules or what have you, like you just don't show up anymore, then yeah, they often have the right to terminate you for cause. Sometimes though, you really want to build in a notice to cure period for things that can be cured. Okay. If, for example, you're showing up late, then that's curable. You really should have like, one, you shouldn't show up late, but if it happens, then you should have an opportunity to be like warned about it, maybe a 10 to 30 day notice period in the termination for cause clauses that can be cured. Maybe that can be very helpful to you. We ask for that sometimes in contracts. Sometimes employers will sneak some stuff in that's just patently unfair in the termination for cause clauses. One is that really kind of rubs me the wrong way is termination for cause for an arrest. Just a mere arrest. Sometimes that's in your contract. And like, I'm from New Orleans. Like stuff happens, man. Sometimes you accidentally get arrested. Like I don't encourage you to get arrested in New Orleans, by the way. It's a terrible experience. I don't know personally, but you know, it's tough. But if something weird happens that is totally unexpected, totally outside of your normal character, like an odd arrest, I mean, should that really be a reason that your employer terminates you effective immediately without really any further discussion? That doesn't make sense. Sometimes the employer will have a termination for cause for losing one of the contracts that you're working under. That's quite substantial, right? Imagine a hypothet where like you primarily work for like one hospital. Let's say that group that you're working for loses that contract. Well, they should really terminate you without cause. You should probably get a 90-day notice period where you have a little bit of a protected off ramp. Frankly, that practice should probably have a few bucks in their bank account to like fund your termination without cause, right? But if they lose the contract, then ultimately your job's probably not going to work out. But they really shouldn't be able to terminate you effective immediately for that. Sometimes then the termination for cause, you'll see like kind of a blanket like publicity, like poor publicity, like you're doing something that they deem unhelpful for their business, something like that. Sometimes I think of it as like the OnlyFans clause. Like I don't know exactly what hypothet would add in there, but I'm not seeing a lot of employers in practice, to be honest, that are using kind of the vague termination for cause clauses to get rid of physicians. Usually they either have a good reason or they, even if they have like potentially have an argument under the termination for cause clauses, they terminate without cause anyways and just avoid a lawsuit from somebody like me saying you messed up. So that's kind of the overview of for cause.
Gotcha. So I think the very important point you kind of identified is, it may sometimes be easier to fire a physician without cause than a with cause, because then you can kind of argue about what is reasonable with cause, right? So have you ever seen or have you done any contracts where you specified what are the for cause termination clauses can be, or are they usually specified in like their employee handbook?
It's usually in the contract. Sometimes in academic settings, it's in a handbook, like a separate policy. I don't always negotiate hard on these clauses. Usually there's other things that are a bigger priority. Okay, so if I see, for example, the arrest clause and the termination for cause clause, like I usually point it out to my client. I'm like, this is nonsense. This really shouldn't be there. But do we want to make that one of our asks? Sometimes when you're like putting together a negotiation strategy around your contract, you realize like I could ask for 30 things. Like I could try to change every single sentence in this thing, but you might have 2 or 3 or 4 things that are just much more important than whether an arrest is going to result in an immediate termination. You might just want to focus on something else. So yeah, that's kind of the negotiation aspect of it.
Gotcha. So focus on the bigger fish to fry, and then not like kind of create a prioritizing list, and then focus on the big things.
Yeah, you got to pick
So
your
no,
battles.
Exactly. I don't know. Let's switch over to like something on the brighter side, right? Because we were talking about termination clauses, but when we were first getting hired, nowadays a lot of the jobs are offering, bonuses, whether it's sign-on bonuses, uh, student loan repayment, sometimes stipends. Could you talk a little bit about these and what the payback clauses usually end up being in the contracts if a physician chooses to leave early?
Sure. I like to talk about those kind of together as the one-off sweeteners. Get your signing bonus, student loan stipend, relocation stipend. Sometimes it's titled a commencement bonus. A bunch of different words that they can use to just define all the money that they pay you before you start doing work for them, right? A lot of employers think of those kind of collectively. Sometimes you can negotiate around when and how much those are paid out. One of my favorite negotiation points, let's say you have neither a signing bonus or a relocation stipend. Okay, let's say you don't have either. Then often we'll ask for both. If you only have one of the relocation or the signing, we can ask for the other. If you have both, this is one of my favorite things. If you have both, you're often better taking the relocation piece, rolling it into the signing bonus, because sometimes the relocation stipend comes with strings attached. You actually have to show like actual receipts that you spent the money to relocate. Sometimes you're not driving that far, or like you don't have that much stuff. Like we had a dog and a kid and two cats, and we're moving across the country. Like we definitely had enough money to spend that entire, like usually it's about $10,000 or $15,000. We definitely had like a lot of stuff to move because we already like had a house and all of that. But there's a lot of folks that don't have that yet. Maybe they have a couple pieces of furniture. Maybe they'll just sell them on Facebook Marketplace before they go, and they'll get some new stuff when they get there. Sometimes it's just, I'm driving over and that's that. Well, you're not going to spend $10,000, right? So sometimes you're better off asking for that to be rolled into your signing bonus. Also, sometimes your signing bonus isn't paid until your first paycheck. But like you might want that now, right? You might need it. You might want it when you actually need it. Let's say you have a $50,000 signing bonus. Like that money is very meaningful to you, like right now in training. But later on, when you make $50,000 a month, not going to really be that. That sounds crazy, right? But it's not going to be that big of an impact on your life later on. So often we'll ask for that to be paid out actually with signing or within 30 to 90 days after signing. But the details around those payments can vary wildly between contracts. Okay. Whenever you receive one of the one-off sweeteners, it usually comes with some sort of service obligation. You should think of it as an advance on work that you haven't performed yet. Okay. So you want to know the details about, okay, what work do I have to do to fully earn this money? If a common provision, let's say you have a $50,000 signing bonus, they'll say, if your job ends for any reason in the next, let's say 2 to 5 years, usually it's 5 years if it's a really big number. Some of like the rad partners number that are like $125,000 to $200,000 in one-off sweeteners, they'll come with like a 4 or 5 year piece. Some of your smaller ones will come with a 2-year clawback. Usually that's a little bit more common. But we'll sometimes negotiate around the length of time that you have to serve to fully earn it. But often if your employment ends for any reason, then you have to pay back some or all of that money. Sometimes your payback obligation is reduced, prorated over your 2 to 5 year period. So in our $50,000 signing bonus example, if it's a 2-year clawback, then if you worked there for only 1 year and the employment ended, you have to pay back $25,000 if it was reduced, prorated. Sometimes those details are terrible, though. Sometimes it's like you have to pay back 100% of it, plus interest, plus sometimes like a few points over prime, which prime rate is really high right now. Sometimes there's like an additional penal piece. I've seen 150% of the signing bonus you own, but you owe back. That can be really rough. Sometimes, like, you'll see $200,000 one-off sweeteners and it comes with a 5-year period. Sometimes it's a 5-year cliff. Like, literally, if you stay there for 4 years and 364 days and then they terminate your contract, you owe it all back plus interest and penalties. It's like, well, that's wild, right? Why are we doing that? The details around when you might owe that money back can be very, very important to negotiate. If you have a big one-off sweetener aspect to your compensation and the clawback provisions are very penal, then it may be very expensive to buy your freedom from the contract. I really want to protect folks' early career from being trapped to feeling golden handcuffed into their first job. A lot of y'all think like, I just did residency, I just did fellowship, like I could power through anything. Powering through that early career, once you're out of training, is going to get harder. It doesn't get easier, it gets harder because now you don't have that like light at the end of the tunnel. Now this is the remainder of your career. We want to protect your ability to leave early on. Big student loan repayments, sign-on bonuses, one-off sweeteners that come with very penal clawback provisions can make that more problematic.
Now, is there a way? So let's say I don't want this one-off sweetener, right? I'm not moving far, or my housing situation is not changing much between my training period and my attendinghood. And so I don't want the one-off sweetener. Is it possible to negotiate a higher starting salary than taking the one-off sweetener? Can I negotiate $50,000 higher salary than taking a $50,000 sign-on bonus?
Potentially, but going back to our RVU discussion, sometimes negotiating for a higher base salary doesn't actually make you more money, because if ultimately you're paid on your RVU conversion factor, then negotiating, let's say your base salary is $400,000 and they say, sure, we'll pay you $450,000. But let's say your volume, the volume that they expect from you every day is such that on volume, when you multiply the ratios, you're going to make 550 to 600 total. Now, when you negotiated for a higher base, you just correspondingly reduced your bonus and you didn't actually get more money on the macro level. Be very careful with making a compensation request before you know everything about the compensation package. I get a lot of folks that come to me with a contract and they said, I negotiated for compensation, I got more money. And then I look at it and I'm like, no, you didn't. Like, you negotiated for a higher base, which again, it increases your floor and gives you a little bit of measure of security, but ultimately you're paid on volume. And for the vast majority of physicians, if they're relying on their base salary and they're never going over that with their bonus structure, that might not work out for the job. Like, the employer might really need you to be well within the bonus structure to make it lucrative enough for them to continue that position. So now you've negotiated for something that really doesn't help you that much. But I do like this idea, though, of, okay, if I can I trade some one-off sweeteners for something that's going to have a longitudinal effect on my total compensation? Is that possible? What I would say is the better way to negotiate compensation is on the rates that you're paid on your volume compared to base salary, compared to those one-off sweeteners. You just paid those one-off sweeteners once, but if you can get the rate on whatever they're paying per unit to bump up by 5% or 10%, like, it might not look that different in the short term, but over the length of your contract, that's going to have a bigger impact.
Yeah, that is definitely an excellent point that I didn't even think about. Yeah, no, for sure that makes sense, because as you said, the employers would want to extract. I mean, there's no free lunch, right? They're extracting some sort of value from the radiologist, and it would be unlikely that the radiologist is getting paid more than they are producing for the practice or for the hospital, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was a really good point. Lastly, I think the one-off sweeteners. So when we have to, so from my understanding, when they come to us, when they get deposited into our bank accounts, it get deposited as like a post-tax money, right? And if you have to pay them back, if they have to if the practice needs to claw back the money, then we have to pay them back on the pre-tax amount plus whatever, if they impose penalties, plus whatever penalties, correct?
Yeah, so the taxes can be handled in two different ways. Sometimes you'll get paid like the total. Let's say you have a $50,000 signing bonus in our hypothet. Sometimes you get a check for $50,000 and then you get taxed on that money when it's forgiven. So now you need to know when, like, what your contract says about that. If it's forgiven all at once in 2 years, now you got to prepare for an additional, what, $25,000 in taxes 2 years from now. Okay. If it's reduced prorated monthly over 2 years, now you pay 1/24th each month of whatever the tax burden is, because that's how much is forgiven of that payment each month. It's considered like earned when it's forgiven for tax purposes. Sometimes you are paid that $50,000, they take taxes out right away. And let's say you get a check for $30,000, even though they told you, like, yeah, here's a $50,000 signing bonus, here's $30,000, congrats. Let's say you wanted to leave in the middle of that 2 year clawback on our $50,000 hypo. They're going to want $25,000. They're not going to want half of $30,000. They're not going to take 15. Okay. There's a couple ways to handle that. By the way, I'm a lawyer. I'm not an accountant. Check with your accountant before. Like, don't rely upon this. Also, like, just to go back to our general disclaimers, like, this is all just a general discussion. I'm not your lawyer, all that stuff. We'll post all that. But for the tax purposes, like trying to figure that piece out, usually the easier way to handle it to avoid like kind of being double taxed is to, during your exit, usually you have a 90-day notice. Okay. During your exit, ask for the employer to take out what is owed before they pay you. So they take it out pre-tax. They gave it to you pre-tax, and now they're taking it out before they tax you. Okay. So you can resolve it as part of just an organized, thoughtful exit from a practice. Also, like it just for like a relationship purpose, like handle all of your debts, like handle everything before you leave. You got a malpractice tail provision, often like handling it the exact same way. Any kind of clawback provisions, handle it before you go. So, the relationships are all real solid. That varies a little bit. If you got a little bit of a dispute, you might not want to do that. You might want to talk to a lawyer before you agree to pay anybody any money under, a contract. That's just probably good general advice, right? Another option with this though is, let's say you have to pay back the $25,000 like from a check from your bank account. You can typically go to your next tax return, claim a deduction, and get a discount on your taxes in your next tax return, or maybe they go back a year and like update the taxes from there. Ask your CPA on that, but I see it handled a couple different ways.
All right, Vedant, you're up.
Yep. So we'll transition to the last part of the episode. So we kind of talked about the initial parts of the contract and then any components of, like the sweetener deals, like you called it. The last part that I think is a big interest for ours is, in terms of partnership agreements, I feel like partnership is defined very differently based off of different practices, even within private practices, and then, also with like private equity firms as well. So, from your experience, how are you seeing partnership be defined? And then, kind of a follow-up from that is, any kind of specific like buy-in amounts and red flags associated with negotiating that aspect of the contract.
Yeah, very important question. So we throw out this term partner a lot. This is also sometimes just the term that physicians that are working together just call each other my partner. It doesn't actually have like the same meaning in my world. Like, I help small business owners, and I help with like small business disputes. A partner has like a legal meaning of a co-owner of a business. Okay. But in the context of like physician employment, partner could mean that, or it could mean you don't own anything. You really want to investigate that. Some employers are offering a free ownership track, like you actually will own a piece of the practice after you provide a certain number of years of support for the practice. You kind of earn your ability to become a co-owner of the business. That's what I really think about as a partner. I like to think of opportunities for physicians as either you are going to become an owner of a business or you're not. If you're not going to be like an owner, you're not going to collect profits of the business, then you're more of a perpetual employee, and that's just kind of structured a little bit different from a contract purpose. Um, Private equity firm buyouts, they often try to blur this line a little bit. They make you maybe feel that you're still an owner, there's still an ownership aspect to the contract, to your relationship, but sometimes not. Sometimes there is a little bit of a gray area here. It can really just depend. I do see that like rad partners, when they advertise for their jobs, they call it independent private practice, and it's like, no, it's just not. That's not what it is, right? That's just not true. But watch out for like, ask them what does this mean? Okay, there are a lot of still pre-existing independent practices in radiology. Before you like consider that as an ownership opportunity, I'm going to do a little investigation into that practice. What contracts do they have? Sometimes I'll see a radiology practice that has one contract with one hospital. They serve that one hospital, and that's that. If that practice ever lost that one contract, then the practice is over. They have no other thing that they do. So really, the buy-in, the partnership is just agreeing that you will abide by that contract with the hospital. There's really not an independent aspect to it. Like the business is not going to continue indefinitely. If you see a business like that, then it's unlikely there's a buy-in, like you're going to pay money to buy into the practice. Okay, because they have one client, right? If that one client goes away, the value of the business is gone. Some practices will have multiple locations, multiple services, and they'll have kind of a diversified business environment. And buying into that could be quite lucrative. Sometimes you have to pay money to buy in to a private practice. The number of ways to structure a buy-in, to value the opportunity to become a co-owner of a business. If you're getting anywhere near this, you really need to get with a lawyer that does this regularly. Make sure that you're not buying something that doesn't have value, or the way that should structure and make sense for this practice setting, for this this industry, that sort of thing. But yeah, when we talk about PE firm buyouts of a private practice, sometimes people throw that term around, but they don't always know exactly what that means. So let's talk about that for a moment. The way that it's structured, just kind of explaining in very basic terms. When a private equity firm buys out a private practice, then they're buying the future revenue streams of that business. They're collecting money off of the revenues that the practice is generating. They can't own the physician group itself. Like only physicians can provide medical care. Okay, you can't have, there's a corporate practice of medicine doctrine. You're not supposed to, as a company, as a corporation, you're not supposed to be practicing medicine. So usually the way it should work is that only physicians are owning the physician group. Okay, but that physician group then contracts for management services with the private equity firm. The private equity firm buys all of the assets of the business. If there's equipment, supplies, sometimes something related to the contracts, the the rights to bill insurance and Medicare, Medicaid for those services. They do all the collections. They just kind of take over the whole management of the practice, such that the physician group itself doesn't really create profits and losses. It really just like those profits now go to the management group, and in return, the management group provides professional services to the practice they help it run. But the question is, okay, what happens to the physicians? What typically happens is they end up with more of like a flat salary-ish type model, or something that rises and falls based on their productivity. They're no longer entitled to the additional profits that might be created by co-owning a business. Okay. Sometimes a private equity firm will also look at a business and say they own the real estate that the business is housed in. Having like buying a commercial real estate asset that has a very, very stable tenant that pays their bills all the time, meaning your private practice, can be very valuable. Sometimes they do like a McDonald's-esque type thing where they buy the practice. Even the practice may or may not be like crazy profitable, but they at least have a commercial real estate asset that they're buying. They're buying those revenue streams. They maybe increase the rent on the practice a little bit. That can happen as well. There's a number of different ways that can be valued, and it all goes into the purchase. But yeah, there's various ways to kind of structure these contracts. But at the end of the day, even though the physician group itself isn't owned per se, the contract with the management services organization kind of sucks the profits out of it and really has control, often has too much control over the way the physicians practice day in, day out. The pressures to keep up with volume to meet the expectations, the contracts with the management group can create the friction that you're now seeing just throughout radiology, throughout private equity owned medicine. That's kind of where it comes from.
Makes a lot of sense. I think that, like you said, that's the obscurization of the word partnership is what we're seeing. And then I think, especially when it was the people that sold the practices were probably partners at some point, and then again that like in between period where it's almost it's very unclear really. And then even from a contract standpoint, it sounds like sometimes they use that language even if you're not truly like a asset ownership a partner in the truest sense. So very, very, very helpful and thoughtful discussion. Again, thank you so much, Michael. This is always a great time, and we always learn a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting, particularly in radiology, diagnostic radiology, trying to figure out what your contracts mean, what's going on behind the curtains, right? What does the general business side of radiology mean for your particular career goals and life plans, and trying to navigate that. I see a lot of exceedingly lucrative contracts that are coming out of private equity owned private practices in radiology. A lot of the practices that were purchased, that were bought out by private equity, are kind of in some financial trouble. You hear a lot of headlines about radiology partners and their struggles with, reworking their debts. It'll be very interesting what happens over the next few years in radiology. I think there's going to be a lot of turnover, a lot of turmoil. So from a contract perspective, I would encourage you to make sure you understand what happens if things go south, if you need to change your job, if you need to get out. What are the exit penalties? What are the legal and financial ramifications of changing jobs? A lot of the private equity practices that were bought out, the original owners are typically required to stay in that business and continue working for about 5 years, a little bit more, a little bit less. It can be very sticky, very difficult to get out of that deal for about 5 years. A lot of radiology private practices were paid like many multiples of their revenue like pretty big buyout numbers to execute these deals. And in return, they're often required to stay for 4 to 6 years, something in that range. But a lot of these deals are coming up on that like 5 year window. And I think a lot of folks are changing jobs, are retiring, are moving around, or maybe have a little bit more leverage to do something different. So I think over the next few years, we're going to see a lot of change here. Just be prepared.
Yeah, maybe it's a discussion for a different time, but I wonder if like we're in a bubble in terms of like radiology salaries, just in terms of like the overall sweetener deals coming from private equity, kind of fluffing things up, and then private practice, like the traditional private practices who are very kind of strictly RVU based and really kind of tied to the overall productivity, having to try to compete, and then the overall just increased kind of supply of radiologists switching jobs. But whether or not in the next couple of years all that kind of settles down, and then it's kind of back to where it's a more kind of linear relationship with productivity, and salaries being adjusted there.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting what happens with the Rad Partners piece. Their debt was like severely downgraded by credit agencies, and the clock's ticking. Be very interesting what happens over the next few years. It seems to me, just from outside looking at employment contracts, that the underlying fundamentals in private practice radiology is just fine. The problem was like taking on all this debt and then trying to service the debt through additional volume, forcing additional volume out of the existing physicians. Like only so much juice in the orange. Like that's it, you know. So once those contracts kind of come to term and folks no longer have to do those things, then I could see quite a bit of turmoil. Yeah, I would really be thoughtful whether you want to take one of those jobs with a private equity backed platform, particularly if there's massive clawbacks on massive one-off sweeteners. You can try to mitigate that by keeping that money in like a high yield savings account, just not spending it, being prepared to pay it back if you need to. But sometimes it's quite substantial.
Michael, once again, it's a great opportunity to talk with you. Thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Have a good one. I appreciate it. I'd love to come back whenever, and we can talk contracts, talk radiology world.
Sounds great.
Definitely. I think we'll have one focused on interventional radiology next, because I think they face also a very unique set of challenges, especially the fact that they have to be more in person on site than our diagnostic radiology folks. But yeah, Michael, it's a huge educational experience. Always love the hour that you give us on this podcast. And I'm sure that our folks and our co-partners in Rad Discord will find this extremely, extremely valuable. This is something that I'll definitely go back to in a few years when I sign my first radiology contract.
Thank you.
All right, have a good night. Take care, everybody.